Well, Shaun, thank you so much for joining the show. Excited to get started. If you could just give everybody a quick introduction about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad to be here. My name's Shaun Rohrich. I am founder and head consultant of a company called Build More Leaders, where we help scale out leadership teams for small and mid-sized businesses. So making sure that their managers can be successful, and we build the culture together in a way that's consistent and helps them actually grow and level up as a company.
That's awesome. And how long ago did you start the company?
Yeah, started this last year, right around this time. So we just hit our first year anniversary.
Congrats. That's so
Yeah,
exciting. So
yeah, it's been
you
going well.
you have a history in talent acquisition, in people operations, leadership and development. So all things related to people. What inspired you to branch out and start your own firm focused on helping organizations cultivate leaders within their businesses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, the the catalyst was really, in the past 2 years, over the past decade, I've been in, like you said, I've been a recruitment manager for small business. And then I've worked for large agencies. I worked for companies supporting teams at LinkedIn, Amex, Google, all those huge companies. And the thing that I kept finding I was asked to do repeatedly was train managers, and mostly people who are new to management roles. And so one stat that I saw that's right, it's probably pretty common by now, but it still holds true. 60% of new managers will fail out of their roles within the first 12 months on the job. And that's been repeatedly shown in studies. And I thought that's so backwards, for a role that's so important in any company. It's actually like driving the culture, driving your bottom line in ways that you don't see. We need to be supporting these people. And also, those people are responsible for not only overseeing the work of so many in our companies, but the people that they're managing are people like you and I that, they go home to their families, they have lives. And if you've ever had a bad manager, I know I have, it really like makes or breaks your career and how you feel when you go home from work. So it's too important to not get right. And it's also not as hard as people think to get right with the right systems. And so that's what really catapulted me into starting this company to restore integrity and creativity and help people influence those around them using their authority well.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And were you finding that companies were struggling more with this with first time managers they promoted internally or people that they hired in from the outside that were becoming a first time manager at their company?
Yeah, it's definitely both. You could inherit an issue, or you could build it yourself. But what we do typically is we'll take the person who's the best at their job. So I want the best salesperson or the best data analyst or whatever, and we say, "Hey, you're amazing at this. Well, we're going to give you a team," and then we don't provide resources to help them do what is actually a completely different job. Right? Being the best salesperson and the best sales manager are two different things. And so I always say, when we don't meet responsibilities with resources, that's when we start to see failures happen.
That's a great point. I think a lot of companies, to the point that you just made, they promote a great individual contributor into a manager role. A lot of times out of fear of we don't have maybe a growth path for that person in an individual contributor role. So let's just make them a manager so we can keep them here longer. But then the reality is if you don't set them up for success in that management position, they're going to be out of there anyways. And in
Yeah,
a less than ideal scenario than if they would have left just based on, not having a growth path there, because now you've like failed them out of the company versus them choosing to just move on to bigger and better things themselves.
right. Yeah, and I think it's really hard to be honest, right? Especially as a leader in a company, an executive's role. And sometimes we don't want to believe, we have the two tracks traditionally is the management role and then the IC role. And we don't necessarily have the systems, not to any fault of our own sometimes, to like help people stay engaged in the IC role or give them more money. And so without the extra responsibility of people. And so
Yeah.
it's helpful when you add some transparency to that, but also from a person standpoint, that employee thinks, well, I know that I want to level up, I want to make a bigger salary, or I want to have more responsibility. And the only way that a lot of people see that is to get into a leadership role. And it's one of the hardest jobs, in any org, is especially middle management. That sucks sometimes. You've got pressure from all sides and not a ton of support. And you've got a full, quote unquote, day job to do. And then you've got to manage this team of people. And how do you get it all done? So you need support, you need resources.
Yep. And how much are you working with your clients on? So I understand the side of building systems and frameworks and processes to set a manager up for success once they're in the management position. But how much of your work with companies involves identifying a good first time, somebody that's a good fit as a first time manager to begin with?
Yeah, definitely. I do a lot of that with so I do one-on-one executive coaching. That usually comes up a lot in those sessions, but the bulk of my work with Build More Leaders is through a program I run called the Leadership Accelerator. And so in that program, typically we're training up either current managers, sometimes executives even go through that, or people who are being set up to go into management roles. And in that, we talk a lot about leadership pipeline, because the best leaders build more leaders. That's why I named my company after that. It's clear, not clever, as I like to say. What we do, but that is the main goal, is replication when you're in a leadership role. And so you have to know, how do you identify those players? How do you keep them engaged? How do you advocate for them as well? Because that's a big part of it, is just making sure that your people know you're on their side and you want to help them and you're going to challenge them and support them.
Yep, that's interesting. And I'd love to dive into building leadership pipeline. I imagine that's referring to you've got some people in the organization that have potential to be a future leader,
Yeah.
and you may still need to coach and nurture them, and develop some skills until they're ready. So is that what you're referring to? And I guess what's the approach for doing that? How do you coach executives you're working with on building that pipeline within their organization?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, essentially, the more common term on this is succession planning in a way, but it's basically, if you look at any team in your org, and you've got a leader that's there, maybe they've been there for a long time, maybe and they're about to retire, maybe they are just brand new to the role. But if they left tomorrow, which at any moment anybody could get a new job or get something in their life that changes, what do you do? And the fact is that most companies don't have a plan for that, because there's so many other fires to put out. There's so many other things that need attention that seem more emergent. But when a leader leaves and you've got that gap, you don't want to be caught in the position of who do we hire, either internally or externally. What do we do here? Even if the plan is, if somebody leaves, we're just going to hire externally. At least know that going in and be clear with your team that that's the plan, and that's fine. You can do that, right? But a proactive stance that I encourage folks to take, especially in smaller companies, is to hire from within, or look at within your talent pool first and say, if Samantha leaves this management role, we know we have these 2 or 3 people that are pretty good candidates for that, and we're actively involving them in some of Samantha's work, conversations, teaching them, stretching them, helping them kind of see themselves as more of a leader. And that way,
Mm-hmm.
if she does leave at some point, you've got a few options internally already. And Samantha, by the way, can be responsible for that, doing that with the team. If you build that into your culture, you say managers are expected to build more leaders up in their teams. And, the ideal situation is you've already got those people built out because your managers are already working on them.
It's a great point. Look, you can definitely relate that to the hiring side of things, where you don't want to be caught in a position where you have to be reactive, right? And that's why a lot of companies and talent acquisition teams are doing always some level of proactive sourcing or pipeline building or nurturing candidate relationships. So when the time comes, they've developed, a group of candidates that they could potentially reach out to about some openings. And so it's the same thing internally, is you have to consistently develop and nurture the people you have internally, or at least have a plan for what you're thinking about doing with that person. So if the time comes, you're not put in a position where, again, most companies go to, which is like, okay, let's promote somebody internally. All right, who do we got? All right, this is a great IC. Let's make them a manager. And that's when things all start to fall apart because you haven't done the prep work and built any foundation to build that leader within the organization before they actually take on a leadership role.
Totally. And here's the other thing too, is like I'm sure you see this as well. Referrals are a big missed opportunity a lot of times too. You don't lose by investing in your people. It just doesn't, it's not the case. But when you invest in your people the way we're talking about right now, they're going to have friends, that are probably doing the same or similar kind of work to them. And they're going to say, hey, you need to work at this company because look what they're pouring into me. They're investing in me. At least they believe in me. And that's really attractive and compelling and less common than you would think also.
Yep. It's a great point too of you never lose when you're investing in people. Like it's always a good investment. I think the thing that a lot of organizations struggle with is the time, capacity, resources, or perceived amount of those things in order to do so. But the reality is you have to find or invent the time and capacity and resources to make the proper investments in people to do the things like you're talking about, drive more referrals into the business, help build more leaders within the business, really create this culture of developing from within. And so I think that's a really, really good point. Let's take it over to the hiring side a little bit. We talked about
Yeah.
developing leaders from within the business. Let's say a company says, hey, our plan is we're going to go hire somebody externally. Maybe we don't see somebody as a good fit internally, or we just have a net new role and we're going to go hire somebody. The seniority of the role indicates it's probably going to be a first time or very green manager. So if I'm somebody hiring for this role and going through this process, what are the things I'm looking for, knowing that it's a first time manager? So I can't really rely on previous management experience to tell me how proficient they are or not as a manager. Is it more behavioral competencies I need to look for? What do you coach your clients on?
Yeah, for sure. Um, I think, most of the time when I'm talking to folks in this boat, it's hire somebody. I advise try to hire for somebody who is a culture add. So we know what our company values are. We get our authority from the values of our companies. And so we want to find somebody that not only just matches those, but like will live those out. And so, yeah, I would definitely advocate for, of course, the behavioral interview questions. Give me a time when you example this, insert your value, whatever that would be. So yeah, you're looking for any past record of somebody doing something right along those lines. And that can be in any role, right? It doesn't matter if it's a management role, but and the skills are pretty universal as well. Integrity being one of those, tell me about a time where you did something right, even though it felt like the hard thing to do, or nobody would have known if you didn't choose that path. And people will usually have something to say, and so that's what I typically advise to look for in any role, really, not just management. So transitions.
Yep, makes sense. Now, as we dig deeper into the hiring process, one of the things that we hear a lot from HR talent acquisition teams is the challenge in collaborating with managers in the hiring process. And so for you guys,
Yeah.
obviously, when you're advising your clients, the name of your company, build more leaders, a big part of that as an existing leader is to build the right team around you. And so I've always
Mhm.
found it kind of like, I don't know the right word for it, conflicting, interesting, odd that it's so hard to get management participation in the hiring process right? It's like always like managers are like, I'm too busy. I don't have enough time to do this. I can't give you good feedback on the candidates because I got my day-to-day job to worry about. What are some of the things when you're advising your clients that you see internally at these companies as a challenge when it comes to management participation in the hiring process?
Yeah, this is a big one. And I mean, it resonates deeply because I have been in that boat too, where you've got these amazing candidates lined up and the manager is ghosting you on, here's all my notes on these candidates. And now it's been a week and I haven't heard back from you. But I know that on Monday, you're going to get back to me and be like, hey, where are we at with all of this? And then I feel like I'm the bad guy and I'm not doing my job when I'm waiting on you.
Yep.
So the thing is we have to have some empathy towards the management roles, right? The fact is 47% of hiring managers have never had any sort of formal interview training. There's a ton of inconsistency there. They do have a lot of other stuff on their plate. And so I think it comes back to the adage of, you've got to teach people how to treat you in a way. And so really not being afraid to say, hey, here's how the process is going to work. Here's my responsibilities in this. Here are your responsibilities. Here's what I expect of you. And, what do you expect of me? How can I serve you best in this? Just having that conversation right up front. When I started doing that as a recruiting manager, it changed the game for me because, whenever I got a new rec in, I'd call that hiring manager up. Or if I was, back in the days when we were in offices, I would go over to their desk and say, hey, I saw you got this new roll up. Do you have 10 minutes to chat? And then you have that conversation, set the expectations collaboratively with them. And that way, you've all got a clear sight of what to do moving forward. And typically, if you extend that empathy, you're going to see a lot better results.
Totally. And I mean, definitely can empathize with managers, right? It's like we all have so much going on in our day to day. I can understand how this hiring initiative that is over here and maybe outside of the scope of what I typically do every single day because it's the first time I've hired somebody in 6 months or whatever, kind of
Mm-hmm.
naturally just falls to the bottom of the list of my priorities because I've got all this other stuff I got to get done or all these other team members I got to work with and I got to this thing popped up during the day or that thing popped up during the day. So I definitely have a lot of empathy with managers. Since you work with so many managers, like what's the perspective you hear? Like a lot of HR teams will say, like, I talk to the manager, I set expectations, but they still don't do what I'm
Mm-hmm.
asking them to do. What's the perspective from the other side of maybe why some of that gets missed? Like we did the kickoff meeting, we align on expectations, but then we're still falling short. Like what do you hear often when you're working with managers?
Yeah, I mean, it always comes down to time, right? I don't have the time to do that. I mean, really, we know in anything is we didn't make the time or set it aside or prioritize it, or there's so many other things that are asking to be fixed, or employees that have challenges, and so that's a lot of the time what it comes down to. But there's always something underneath that too. There's an emotional driver I find underneath those things, and so what's going to serve everybody best also is if I always advocate for like the more you can systematize things or just make it easy for people to say yes, the better time you're going to have. That's true in sales, that's true in recruitment, in HR. And so what are the things that you can do to make it easy that don't cost you a ton of extra time as a talent or HR person? One example, in the Accelerator program, I train managers on recruitment. And I give them a bank of interview questions, like proven, safe, behavioral interview questions based on like what you're trying to suss out, whether that's culture fit or experience, different things. And so, is that something you can do with your managers? Can you find the points of that process that stress them out the most, take them the most time, and can you, because you're an expert at this, take 5-10 minutes and say, hey, I put together this doc. It's just like a simple 5-question interview template. Feel free to use it. You'd be surprised how much of a deal that would be to a manager.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's all about enabling and empowering your hiring managers to do what they need to do. And I think where some HR and TA teams fall short is they have the resources or information available, but then they expect the hiring managers to go and find it or figure out how to act on it or whatever it may be to actually make that information and those resources actionable. And I think that's really where, yeah, if it's not a lot of effort for you to take that extra step to set up a hiring manager, going back to setting up managers for success, the same thing goes when you're working with the hiring managers. what can you do to just consistently make it easier and easier for them? And so sometimes it's like, hey, in an ideal world, a hiring manager might set a block on their calendar every day that's non-negotiable, that's dedicated to hiring activities. And maybe you can give that to them as advice, but like whether they do it or not and whether they make it non-negotiable, is kind of up in the air and up to them. And it's very easy for other responsibilities to, leak and overtake that in their calendar. And so maybe it's something where as easy as like you send them the invite, you put the block in their calendar. Don't wait for them to do it. Like
Right.
help them and just say this is part of what we do when we hire as a company. Like every hiring manager is expected to take 30 minutes every day dedicated to the activities they need to do for the hiring process. I'm going to send you a recurring invite for Monday through Friday for that 30-minute block. It's already on your calendar. I'll put the link into the tasks where you got to go find the tasks that you have to do. Like whatever it is, like everything is
Yeah.
just make it as easy as possible for them to get to do, to do what they need to get done.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And to add on to that too, I think that a lot of times I know early in my career too, managers feel scary a little bit, especially if you're newer into a talent role. It's just like, these are my customers, and I'm accountable to them, which is true. And at the same time, you're on the same team. And so don't be afraid to drive them a little bit. Don't be afraid to, I used to put every Friday, I'd send an email in the morning, say, hey, here's what got done this week. Like I screened these, I did these first initial screens. Here's what I need from you. I've got these 4 people in the pipeline you need to interview. When can you get that done by? And most of the time, you actually find that the managers are super thankful because if it's just in one place, amazing. It's all there for me. I know what I need to do. I'll check it off. But it becomes, as a talent person, this is your whole world. This is just like 10% of a manager's job
Yep.
for that week, right? So making it easy is a big deal for them.
Yep. Yeah. And to your point, like being proactive about your communication and constantly checking in to see if they need anything. Is there anything you can help them with? If you notice they're falling behind, like offer a helping hand to help them get caught up. Like, be willing to roll up your sleeves and help them get the things done. You brought up an interesting thing in the prep leading to this episode. You had an interesting quote. You said, you can build your team intentionally or it'll get built for you. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
relates a lot to managers in the sense that, look, like you can choose to be part of the process, or the process will just be what determines who ends up on your team. When you think about that quote, like what comes to mind for you in terms of being intentional with the hiring process, specifically from the hiring manager's perspective?
Yeah, definitely. And we kind of hit on this earlier with the succession planning thing too, right? That's a big part of it is when we're building out our teams, whether it's a brand new team or an existing one, the team has to come together. And so you can either take the stance of looking forward, planning for that, or just when the fire comes up, you got to put it out, and the first warm body that seems to meet the qualifications is going to be the person, right? Um, but when I think about this, there's a couple things that come to mind that really steered this in my mind. So I was looking this up recently because I was curious, but being intentional is a huge cost avoidance for managers, both in time and in money. I read this study yesterday that said, I think it was from SHRM, the average cost of a bad hire right now is about 240 grand. And so that's scary. If one deliberate hour up front can save you or your company a $240,000 mistake, yeah, I'll spend that hour. That's a good hourly wage. But it's also, as a hiring manager, making your life easier. You get the right person in the seat. You're going to get faster ramp up, faster productivity. You're going to have a reduce of rework and stress on your plate. And so you get a better quality hire when you're a little intentional, and you're not going to fill that role again in 6 months, right? When that person didn't work out, or live up to what you were hoping. Sometimes that's, the person that you hire. Sometimes that's, or a lot of times I would say that's the hiring manager's challenge. I don't want to use the word fault, but like challenge is that, we didn't really think through the big rocks we need that person to move. We just know here's the kind of person I need, but like, what do you really need them to get done actually when you're hiring? And so that's why I advocate for that intentional hiring.
For sure, especially with a new position, but even more so sometimes I think when it comes to a backfill, because I think often what happens is you have a person in a role and they're doing what they do and they decide to leave and you just say like, we just need to fill this seat without being intentional about like, what do we actually need as a team, as a company. Sometimes it might mean we don't actually need to backfill at all. And sometimes it might mean we have to hire somebody, but maybe it's not the same role or same responsibilities that this person was doing before. So sometimes it's like you know force yourself to take a step back and really think through what do we need moving forward versus what we had previously.
Right. Yeah. Every requisition is an opportunity in that sense, right? A good opportunity to look forward, like look where you've come from, and then look forward to where do we need to go next,
Yep.
and who do we need to get us there?
Yep. And what would be your advice because you work with so many managers? We want them to be involved and be an active participant and be somewhat of an author of the plan for how we're going to hire for this role and who we're looking for. At the same time, we want them to work within the confines of the processes and framework and tools and all the things that the HR talent team has set up for the organization's way of hiring. I think oftentimes a lot of managers, especially longtime managers, might come in and say, well, this is how I've gone about it forever. So I just want to do it this way. And it's like, but that doesn't fit with the way we're trying to hire as an organization to hit the objectives we want to achieve or build the culture we're trying to cultivate as an organization. So being that you work with so many managers, being that you've previously been in a talent acquisition and other people oriented roles, what would be your advice to people when they're working with hiring managers that are trying to get that buy in to like, hey, love that you want to be an active participant, but also like, I need you to do these things that we're asking of you in the hiring process?
Yeah, it's such a sales part of the role, right? You've really got to sell the hiring manager on the process. And so the biggest thing there is help them understand how it's going to benefit them. And you know that starts by with the conversation of like, hey, what's been your, if it's like a first time, the first time you're working with that hiring manager, maybe you could have a conversation like, yeah, help me understand how you filled roles in the past, or like what have been struggles, what have you liked or not liked. Get to know what they're about in that regard, and then leverage that info to help them and help you get through that process more smoothly. Again, teach people how you work, you know, saying things like, you know, well, when I work with hiring managers, I've seen that, you know, struggle in the past. That's why we do it this way now. It's, you know, when I talk about this stuff, sometimes people feel, well, yeah, Shaun, that takes a lot of extra time, or it's a lot, so much more effort. I'm like, yeah, but you're, it might be an extra 30-minute meeting on the front end of this, but think about all the frustration you're negating down the road for the next 2, 3 weeks, however long it takes to fill this role. How much less rework and frustration that you're going to have and that person's going to have later on in the process. And the other thing is people are going to want to work with you more too. And so when Rex come up, or when there's a promotional opportunity for you as a talent person, everybody's going to say, hey, I've worked with this person and they made the process so much easier for me, or even fun. And you know, they get good results. And so it does nothing but benefit you. It's worth the investment in that process to have a conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think there's a couple important points there. One, you know, I know you're referencing to, you know, people within the organization will want to work with you more when you're, you know, actively contributing and working as a team, but also the impact on the candidate experience is also huge. Like a
Oh
candidate
yeah.
can see when a hiring manager is not that engaged in the hiring process. They're slow to respond. It takes forever to hear back. It's hard to book an interview with them, whatever it may be. They're unprepared when they show up for the interview. They're asking you the same things they heard in the last interview. And so I think that's often a missed piece is when we are unprepared or we're not doing the things we need to do as a hiring manager, that shows on the candidate side. And
Yeah.
that is actually a deterrent for candidates wanting to join the organization, because you as the hiring manager are the person they're going to be working for. And
Right.
you want them to want to work for you. So why not show up as your best self in the hiring process? So I think that's a really important point. The other thing that you brought up, which I find interesting as a motivation tactic, because I've talked to a lot of HR and TA people that are doing a really good job of engaging hiring managers, and they often focus on tying it to the business objective, tying it to the positive outcomes, the things that we're trying to achieve, which I think is one side of it. The other side of it, though, which you touched on, is tying it to making them remember when they touched a hot stove in the past,
Yeah.
right? People run faster away from a grizzly bear chasing them versus how fast they run towards a pot of gold. And
Right.
so sometimes you have to remind people of the negative experiences of when the hiring process hasn't gone well, or when they've hired the wrong person because of mistakes they made on the hiring process, and make them understand I'm here to help make sure that you don't have to go through that again. That doesn't
Yeah.
have to be our reality. We don't have to onboard somebody from 90 days, part ways with them, and do this whole thing over again. I don't want that to happen. So, like, let's work together to make sure we don't end up in that place. And as a result of doing that, we'll also have a better outcome in the hiring process and hire a better person and be able to achieve our objectives. But first and foremost, like, you remember how much that sucked. Let's not do that again. And so I
Yeah.
think that's a really, you kind of have to balance both sides of it. You don't want to always have to use the stick versus the carrot, but I think that's certainly part of it.
Yeah. And all business problems are people problems at their core. All business problems are people problems. And so this is, a little bit of psychology, but really, yeah, exactly. Helping them understand what is the undesired outcome that we are trying to avoid together here. And I'm going to show you how I'm going to help you avoid that. And we're going to be best friends. This is going to be awesome.
Love it. Cool. Well, I also want to talk a little bit about identifying and finding the right leaders. I know we touched on it earlier about how do you identify a good first time manager in the hiring process. So going back to that a little bit, are there things that in the hiring process when we're looking for a leader they should innately have? Like, we need to make sure like this is a hard requirement. They either have it or they don't. And then are there things that like we are really looking for from a potential standpoint of like we can coach them on this, assuming we have the right things in place to
Yeah.
do that internally. Like what's the blend of that? What are, if you were in a position hiring for a leader, like what are the non-negotiable leadership skills and qualities that you need to evaluate for versus what are some of the things that they can learn and develop within the organization?
I think some of these are universal traits, and they'll vary based on your cultural beliefs, your background, all of that. But things I'm always looking for, number one on the list is integrity, and pretty close to that, if not tied with that, is coachability. And so there's nothing worse than, well, maybe not nothing worse, but it's pretty bad, is a uncoachable leader, because you will be somebody at some point, it might be you in an HR role, probably will be you in an HR role, is going to have to give that person feedback that they don't want to hear, or ask them to do something that they don't want to do. And I've worked with those managers in talent role and as an exec coach and all that, where nothing's their fault. It's everybody else, or it's the pressure, the circumstances, and they can't take feedback. And that is a really hard boat to be in for everybody. And so that the more I talk about it, that might be my number one is, are you coachable? And the easiest way to summarize a lot of this for this question is, hire for culture, train the rest. Train what you can. Everybody's got the ability to learn, hopefully, if they're coachable. And so the practical stuff, you may have a baseline of, we need you to know this software, or we need you to have experience doing these things, whatever, sure. But there are a lot of things you can train, but culture fits and culture add is harder to train. So yeah, look for somebody who's coachable, who meets your culture, and make sure the gap isn't too big on the stuff you need to train, and you'll be pretty good.
Love it. And from a coachability standpoint, what are ways during the interview process you can evaluate for that, whether that's, maybe it's certain types of questions you need to ask and what you're looking for in the responses. Maybe it's how they respond to the feedback you give them in an interview setting, or maybe it's talking to references or people that they've worked with in the past. Like, what have you found to work best and getting a sense of that?
Yeah. I mean, references are a really good way to go about that if you can get them. A lot of times, other employers are kind of hesitant to give those, and so it doesn't. So especially when it doesn't, they don't see the benefit to them giving that info out. But anyways, I think that the biggest way I've approached this in the past is, yeah, certain questions like, tell me about a time where you received a piece of tough feedback. What did you do with that? And what was that conversation like for you? Um, the most amazing way, if you can somehow get it, is talking to people they've managed in the past or worked with in the past. And you can check out if it's an industry where people are active on LinkedIn, see if they have any endorsements from previous employees. Another good question would be, if I were to talk to somebody you've managed, what would they tell me about your leadership style? You can kind of feel it out that way. Or if I was to call your boss, what would be the biggest thing that they'd say you need to work on? Are they
Mm.
actually able to say, here's what I'm working on right now? Or are they just perfect, or they don't have anything to work on?
Yep. That's a great point. So, first of all, I love the question asking, like, hey, if I were to talk to so and so, what would they say about X, or how would they describe Y about you? And I think when it comes to coachability, a really good follow up there is, okay, you know this, and they were your manager, or they are maybe your manager still. What have you been actively doing about it to improve in those
Yeah,
areas? And so I think sometimes it's like people are they know immediately what somebody would say they need to improve on, or maybe they have the self awareness to know what they need to improve on themselves. But I think where you find like, okay, but then truly how coachable are they depends on what action they've taken. Like there's a difference between being receptive to constructive criticism and coaching versus being action oriented and like taking that coaching and actually doing something about it. Like
yeah,
coachability is not, I didn't get upset when you gave me feedback. So that makes me coachable. Like I wasn't
right,
pissed that you told me I need to work on X, Y, and Z. It's that I processed that feedback and I actually did something with it.
right. Yep, yeah. The table stakes is being able to receive the feedback and then, yeah, being able to do something with it is a big part. And if you want to see somebody squirm a little bit in an interview, you ask, when I talked to your last manager, what are they going to tell me about that? Every time I've asked that question, you kind of see people like sit up straighter and,
Yeah, they
oh
always sit up straight, or you get like that awkward laugh a little bit.
yeah,
Like they know exactly what that person would say about them. And
yeah, yeah. When instead of if will be a
yeah,
big deal.
yeah, totally. Well, as you like continue to work with more and more managers, and you see them involved in the hiring process, like, is there anything that you've seen over the last couple of years? You've obviously worked in, you know, we've mentioned it a few times on this call, but in recruitment, in
Mhm.
people ops, all these different areas. Have you seen anything change over the last few years related to hiring managers and their willingness to, engage in the hiring process? Or maybe, at least from my perspective, I'll give you some context as to what I'm getting at here is we've seen a lot of companies say, hey, like we're gonna keep a really lean HR talent acquisition team, but we are growing and we need to hire. And oftentimes the HR person might be responsible for other things that aren't just talent acquisition. So they're running very lean. And so by the nature of that, they require hiring manager participation maybe more so in the hiring process than they have in the
Mhm.
past. Is that something that you're seeing with managers, and how are they responding to that?
Yeah, it absolutely is. So I think two things there. One is the what you were just mentioning is, yeah, hiring managers are getting more and more involved by necessity in filling their roles. And for a lot of my clients who are in smaller companies that may have like one or two HR people who also typically help with hiring, you know, they HR is just kind of there to handle the paperwork, and hiring managers sometimes are even responsible for posting the role, doing all the interviews, going through everything themselves, which is a really can be a tough spot to be in when you've got so much other work on your plate. And so that is a trend that I've noticed. And so doing things to equip your hiring managers is a big part of that. The other thing is the second thing is there're just a lot more amazing tools out there right now for to help fill those gaps or just to help companies, you know, um, operate under that more lean structure. So things like Spark Hire, things like AI. I mean, there's amazing tools that can help reduce that workload and the stress that comes with that, and make sure that everybody's able to get the hiring done effectively and not incur those huge costs that we talked about earlier.
Yeah. And so, what advice would you have for somebody in an HR role right now that's experiencing this
Mm-hmm.
more so than they have in the past? And now they need this reliance on hiring managers more so than in the past. And so, they've had this old way where they've been used to working with hiring managers. And now there's this new expectation where they're like, not only is it good for you to be part of the hiring process, but I need you or we're not going to be able to get this
Yeah.
done. What advice would you have for those people that are trying to make that shift and really get hiring managers to understand the HR side of it and the pain that they're feeling to get that buy-in so they, are willing to lend a helping hand?
Yeah, I think just being on one is being honest with them, just like, hey, here's where we're at as a company. The number one skill that I think anybody in an HR talent role needs to know over the next few years is your role is now shifted, whether you like it or not. You have to have more of a business mind and approach to your role. The days of just compliance and making sure things are kept in check, those are dwindling. And so you need to know how to justify the work that you're doing, not in a scary way, but just like in a leveraged way. If you want to bring on a new tool to help you with this, to help your hiring managers, we need to understand what are the metrics that we can figure out that are measurable, whether that's, hey, this is going to reduce our time to fill by 50% roughly, and that's going to save us 30 grand on every hire. Or, all those retention metrics we've talked about, they're out there. The equations are all out there. A quick Google search is going to help you find them. But set up your dashboard and then advocate for the stuff that you need. If that's a tool, if that's a training program for you or for your hiring managers, it's going to be advantageous to you and the company. It's going to be a win-win to be able to say, here's what I'm advocating for us doing, given the season of business we're in, and here's the financial justification for that. And if you come to any executive like that, they may say no still to what you're, looking to get on board, but you're going to be seen as a all-star because HR people don't feel equipped to do that these days. And it's that thing we've been talking about throughout this conversation is like the little extra effort on the front end that pays huge dividends on the back end.
Yep. And a lot of that all ties up nicely for this episode around the theme of leadership. That is definitely a leadership skill, not only being able to present to other leaders within the organization in a language that makes sense, but it's more so the proactiveness to learn about what matters to them, and then the coachability and the pursuit of, okay, now I know what matters to them. So how do I make what we're trying to achieve relevant to that and present it in that way? And some of that means like you got to go talk to other leaders within the organization to get their perspective and be vulnerable a little bit and ask for help. That's another big part of
Right.
leadership is like, hey, I'm trying to make this case for X. I don't really know where to start. Like, and you maybe go to somebody else within the organization, like, hey, how have you done this in the past? Like, I'd love to learn from you. And that vulnerability helps build trust. So, with that,
Yep.
for anybody listening here, whether they're an HRTA or maybe they're just, a hiring manager, Do you have any recommended resources, books, podcasts, anything that provide to people that you're advising on the client side that you think would be helpful for HR or TA leaders looking to be more strategic, take more of a leadership type of role?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are in the golden age of content, and so there's a million and one resources out there, which is amazing. I love it. You know, I to plug you, Josh, a little bit. I think the podcasts that you are doing, I've listened through a number of them. Amazing content in there. One book that I would recommend to anybody, whether you're in a management role or not, is Five Levels of Leadership by John Maxwell. Great baseline to understanding that leadership is nothing more, nothing less than influence. And you got to understand what level you're at with each individual in your sphere of influence. And then you can understand how to level up, build trust through vulnerability, through different capabilities there. So that's a great book that I recommend everybody read. And there's a ton of podcasts out there as well, like this one that are awesome supplement.
Well, thank you for the compliment, but this
Yeah,
podcast is only as good as the great experts like you that come on and actually join me. I'm just here to help facilitate. So I appreciate it, Shaun. This was great. I really appreciate all the insight. I appreciate your time and coming on here and offering that to not only me but our audience. And I know everybody's going to take a lot away from this episode and be ready to take all of these leadership insights and tips and skills and resources to go back into their organization and do something about it and take the next step with whatever challenge that they're facing right now. So, Shaun, thank you very much.
yeah, Josh, my pleasure. It's been amazing. Thank you.